In 1974, retirement was not a financial product. It was a Thursday. The last Thursday. The one where your foreman shook your hand in front of the whole shift, and somebody brought a sheet cake from the Kroger on Route 9, and someone else made a speech that went on too long, and you nodded through all of it because you were already somewhere else in your head. Already at the lake. Already in the garden. Already wherever you had been promising yourself you'd get to once the alarm clock stopped having authority over your life. Walter Briggs retired on a Thursday in October of 1974. He was 62 years old. He had worked for the Ohio Bell Telephone Company for 31 years, the last 14 as a line supervisor out of the Columbus District Office. He drove a 4-year-old Buick LeSabre. He wore the same brand of work boot every year, Chippewa, resoled twice before he bought a new pair. He kept his lunch in a metal pail his wife Dorothy had packed for him every working morning since Eisenhower was president. 31 years. Same company. Same pension plan. Same promise. And here is the thing about that promise in 1974. It was written down, it was funded, and it was going to be kept. The pension was a defined benefit plan, not a defined contribution, not a 401k where the market decides what your life is worth on the day you need the money. A defined benefit, the number was in the contract. Ohio Bell was going to pay Walter Briggs a monthly check for the rest of his life, regardless of what the Dow did, regardless of who got elected, regardless of anything except the fact that he had shown up every day for 31 years and done the work they hired him to do. The check was going to arrive. Same amount, adjusted for inflation, every month until he died. That was the deal. And in 1974, that deal was considered completely normal. Walter also had Social Security. He had paid into it since his first paycheck in 1943. The benefit he collected was designed, explicitly by law, to replace a meaningful portion of his pre-retirement income. Not a supplement, not a supplement to a supplement. The foundational floor built to hold weight. And he had Medicare, which in 1974 had been law for 9 years, and which meant that Walter Briggs, at 62 years old, was not going to have to choose between his heart medication and his electric bill, was not going to have to call his daughter to ask if she could cover the specialist visit, was not going to spend the years he had earned in quiet terror of a diagnosis that would consume everything he had saved. 3 things: pension, Social Security, Medicare. The government and his employer had agreed, decades in advance, that a man who worked 31 years deserved 30 more years of security. That was not generosity. That was a social contract, written down, signed, funded, and Walter Briggs drove the LeSabre home on that last Thursday, walked through the kitchen door at 3:15 in the afternoon, hung up his coat on the same hook he had hung it on for 19 years, and started the rest of his life. The first thing he did was sleep past 6, not 6:30, not 7. He slept until 8:15 on a Friday morning, which was the latest he had slept since a bout of flu in 1961, and which Dorothy noted in her journal. She had kept one since 1952 with an exclamation point. The second thing he did was drive to the hardware store, not to buy anything specific, just to walk through it slowly, to run his hand along the handles of the tools in the garden section without needing to be somewhere in 40 minutes. He bought a bag of tulip bulbs and a new trowel, spent 23 minutes at the register talking to the owner about whether the freeze was coming early that year. That was retirement in 1974. The luxury was not money. It was time conducted at your own speed. Walter's routine settled in the way routines do when they're not imposed from outside. Gradually, naturally, like water finding its level. He was up by 7 most mornings. Coffee on the stove, the Columbus Dispatch spread on the kitchen table, the crossword done in pen. Dorothy called it showing off. He called it optimism. They'd been doing that particular exchange since 1956, and both of them had the timing down perfectly. Mornings were the garden. Afternoons were the garage, where he had a workbench going back 30 years, a full set of hand tools on pegboards he'd made himself, and projects that always had another project waiting inside them. He built a cedar chest for his daughter's birthday. He rebuilt the carburetor on a '67 Ford F-100 pickup he bought from a neighbor for $400 and had running perfectly by Thanksgiving. He made a rocking horse for his grandson from a plan he found in a 1958 issue of Popular Mechanics that he'd kept in the garage all those years because you never knew when you'd need it. He fished. Every Tuesday and Thursday morning from April through October, he was at Hoover Reservoir by 6:15 with a thermos and a tackle box and whatever novel Dorothy had recommended, which he never opened once he got the line in the water, but which he told her he was reading because the conversation afterward was better than the book. The reservoir was 20 minutes from the house. He paid $12 a year for his Ohio fishing license. Gas was cheap enough that the drive barely registered. His total monthly expenses in retirement were about $460. Mortgage had been paid off in 1971. His pension covered the utilities, the groceries, the car insurance, and left money remaining at the end of every month. Social Security was additional. He did not have an investment portfolio. He had a savings account at the Fifth Third Bank on Broad Street and a Christmas Club account that he and Dorothy had maintained since 1958, in which they used every November without guilt. He was not rich. He had enough, and enough in 1974 was genuinely enough. The neighborhood in those years smelled like cut grass and charcoal lighter fluid on summer evenings, like chimney smoke in October, like the particular dry chemical smell of a furnace cycling on for the first time in November. The Briggses lived on Cook Road in Worthington, Ohio, a quiet street of post-war ranch houses with deep lots and two-car garages, and the kind of sidewalk where you could walk 3 blocks in either direction and someone would wave from a porch. Walter knew the name of every family within 4 houses in either direction. He had borrowed their tools and lent his own. He had helped put up fences and carry furniture and load moving trucks. He had brought food when there was a death and stood in the yard at the sound of raised voices in a way that didn't intrude, but made it clear that the block was watching. That was a community in 1974, not a neighborhood marketed as a community, not a development with a community room and a HOA newsletter, a street where people knew each other because they had been living near each other for years, and the infrastructure of daily life, the same hardware store, the same school calendar, the same monthly bills, the same weather, had made them acquainted with each other's lives whether they sought it or not. Walter and Dorothy took 1 trip a year, usually in February, when Ohio in winter had made its case and lost. Florida, mostly, they drove. 2 days down on I-75, a motel in Macon one night, Bradenton or Sarasota by the afternoon of the second day. They rented a cottage for 2 weeks from a man named Carroll, who had been renting the same 3 cottages on the same street to Ohio retirees for 20 years, and who had Walter and Dorothy's name in his reservation book in the same penciled handwriting every February, like a ritual. The cottage ran $80 a week. They brought groceries from home in a cooler and cooked most nights. Total cost for the Florida trip, including gas, motels, the cottage, and spending money, approximately $340, about 3/4 of a single month's pension. They went every year until 1989. Carroll retired. The cottages sold to a developer. Condominiums now. The medicine cabinet in Walter's bathroom in 1974 contained aspirin, a blood pressure medication his doctor had prescribed, and a bottle of antacid tablets. The blood pressure prescription cost him $4 and some change at the pharmacy. He paid it out of pocket because it was $4. Medicare covered everything that couldn't be handled for $4. He went to Dr. Harrington on West Dublin Granville Road twice a year for checkups. Harrington had been his doctor since 1961. He knew Walter's father had had a bad heart. He knew Walter's weight tended to creep up in winter and drop in spring with the gardening. He knew Dorothy's name and asked after her at every visit, not as a pleasantry, but as a medical observation, because a doctor in a general practice in 1974 understood that his patient's wife was also clinical information. The appointment lasted 45 minutes. There was no billing department. There was no prior authorization. There was no insurance company on hold, deciding whether the thing Dr. Harrington thought Walter needed was medically necessary. Dr. Harrington decided what Walter needed. He was the doctor. Walter paid a small copay. Medicare covered the rest. Nobody sent a collections notice. Nobody built a credit score event out of a chest x-ray. That is so far from the current reality of American healthcare. that describing it feels like describing a foreign country. It was not a foreign country. It was Ohio. It was 1974. Walter's son, Gary, graduated from Ohio State in 1978. He got a job at Nationwide Insurance, also in Columbus, stayed for 11 years, bought a house in Dublin in 1983 for $81,000, and eventually rolled into his own retirement in 2019 on the back of a 401k that had started strong, dropped 40% in 2008, recovered most of it, and ultimately left him with enough to retire on if he was careful, which he was, because he had been frightened since 2008 into a kind of permanent financial vigilance that his father never once felt. Gary's retirement is different from Walter's in every structural way. No defined benefit pension. Nationwide ended its pension program in the mid-1990s. Gary has a 401k balance that he monitors on his phone, with the attentiveness of a man watching a weather system move toward his house. It is enough, for now, as long as the market cooperates, as long as his health holds, as long as he doesn't need anything unexpected. That last clause, as long as he doesn't need anything unexpected, is the entire difference between Gary's retirement and his father's. Walter's retirement had no such clause. The pension arrived. The Medicare covered it. The Social Security supplemented. The system had been built to absorb the unexpected, because the people who built it understood that unexpected things happen to people in their 60s and 70s with a regularity that should surprise nobody. Walter never had to think about a worst-case scenario, not because he was lucky, because the system had been designed to make the worst-case scenario something other than catastrophe. Gary thinks about it every week. Walter's granddaughter, Gary's daughter, is named Kelsey. She is 34 years old. She has a master's degree in public health from Ohio State. She works for a nonprofit in Columbus doing health policy work. She makes $53,000 a year. She has a 403b retirement account, to which she contributes 6% of her paycheck, because that's what the enrollment form suggested, and she has not had time to revisit whether it's enough because the honest answer frightens her. She has no pension. She has no expectation of Social Security that isn't couched in some version of assuming it's still there. She says that phrase the way her grandfather never said anything like it in his life, assuming it's still there. A hedge that would have been incomprehensible to Walter Briggs in 1974, who had no reason to doubt that the thing he had paid into for 30 years would be there when he needed it, because it had been designed by people who intended to fund it and maintain it and protect it as a cornerstone of American life. Kelsey pays $840 a month for a one-bedroom apartment in Clintonville. She does not own a home. The Dublin house that Gary bought in 1983 for $81,000 is assessed at $412,000. The down payment alone would require her to save her entire current annual salary twice over. She is not saving her annual salary. She is covering rent, student loan payments, a car, health insurance through her employer that has a $2,700 deductible she hit last year when she needed an MRI for a knee injury. The MRI was medically necessary. She paid the deductible. It took 8 months to pay off. She does not fish on Tuesday and Thursday mornings. She is at her desk at 8. She will be at her desk at 8 for the foreseeable future, which is not the same thing as 31 years and a Thursday in October and a sheet cake from the Kroger. Here is what happened. It was, again, policy. Specific, documented, deliberate choices made by specific people in specific rooms. The shift from defined benefit pensions to defined contribution plans was not a natural evolution. It was a deliberate corporate strategy, accelerated after the Revenue Act of 1978 created the legal architecture for the 401k. Companies discovered they could transfer the risk of retirement security entirely onto their employees. The employee now bore the market risk, the longevity risk, the inflation risk. The company wrote a check to match up to a percentage and considered the obligation discharged. What was lost? Certainty. The thing that made Walter Briggs sleep past 6 on that Friday morning without fear was not the amount of his pension. It was the certainty of it. He knew the number. He knew it was coming. He did not have to watch anything, monitor anything, rebalance anything, or pray for anything. He had worked. The deal had been made. It was being honored. The 401k system replaced certainty with participation. Here is your account. Here is the market. Good luck. At the same time, the defined benefit system for public employees, teachers, postal workers, municipal and state employees, came under sustained political attack beginning in the 1990s and accelerating sharply after 2008. States across the country, facing pension shortfalls that were partly the result of the very financial crisis that had just devastated everyone else's retirement savings, began restructuring, underfunding, and in some cases effectively dismantling the defined benefit systems that had been the bedrock of public sector retirement security for 50 years. The people who had taken government jobs partly because of the pension stability were told, mid-career, that the stability had been revised. Medicare remained, but was progressively constrained. The copays rose. The coverage gaps widened. The pharmaceutical benefit came late and came with a donut hole that required seniors to pay full price for medications once they crossed a threshold. The negotiating power that other developed nations use as a matter of course, the government bargaining with drug companies on behalf of the population, was specifically prohibited by the legislation that created Medicare Part D in 2003. Prohibited, written into the law that the government was not allowed to negotiate drug prices because someone in a room decided that the drug company's profit margin was a more important variable than what a 74-year-old in Ohio paid for her blood pressure medication. The Social Security retirement age was raised. The benefit formula was adjusted. The trust fund projections became a perennial source of electoral anxiety, a program that Walter's generation treated as a given. The floor became something that every subsequent generation has been trained to doubt, which is its own kind of damage, independent of whether the doubts are justified. The house Walter paid off in 1971 for $26,000 is assessed today at $398,000. His grandson, at 38, is renting in Westerville. The mortgage on a starter home in Worthington would run $2,100 a month. His take-home after taxes and health insurance is $2,600. He is trying to save a down payment. He is also managing the student loans from the degree he needed to get the job that pays him the income that isn't quite enough. Walter had no student loans. Walter had an apprenticeship and a union card. Walter had an employer who treated his retirement as a liability the company had a legal and moral obligation to fund. Walter had a government that had made him a set of promises and kept them. Walter retired on a Thursday and spent the next 18 years doing exactly what he had spent 31 years, promising himself he would do once he got the time. He gardened, he fished, he drove to Florida every February. He fixed things in the garage and made things at the workbench and walked the neighborhood in the evening and knew every name on every mailbox within 4 houses in either direction. He died in 1992 in his own house, Dorothy beside him. The cedar chest he built was in his daughter's bedroom. The rocking horse was in the grandchildren's playroom. The 67 F-100 was in Gary's garage, still running. He left behind a paid-off house, a small savings account, and the quiet proof that a working American life, built on honest labor and a government that had decided that honest labor deserved an honest retirement, could end with dignity. Not wealth, not a legacy portfolio, not a financial plan. Dignity. That used to be the minimum we offered each other. It is now considered an aspiration. And the distance between minimum and aspiration, that gap, that distance, that space where the deal used to be, is not an accident of history. It is the result of choices, made deliberately, by people who understood exactly what they were trading away and decided the trade was worth it for them.